I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
For most of his adult life, Prince William has worn grief the way royals are taught to, quietly, structurally, with barely a tremor showing on the surface. That composure finally cracked inside a locked wing of Windsor Castle, where palace archivists handed him a manila folder labeled the Kensington Memorandum, a sealed relic that had been sleeping in the royal vault since the summer Diana died. Inside it sat his mother's own handwriting, scrawled across several handwritten pages just weeks before the Paris crash, and a warning aimed squarely at her eldest son. By the time William turned to the closing paragraph, his hands had gone still. He set the pages down, kept his eyes fixed on the table, and asked a single quiet question that left everyone in the room without a clean answer. The summons had come unexpectedly. Archivists preparing a routine review of Diana's archived correspondence stumbled on the restricted file marked for the personal protection of Prince William. No previous catalogue had ever listed it. Catherine travelled to Windsor with him that morning but was asked to wait outside while he read alone. What unfolded on those pages was not a letter of love. It was a record of alarm. Diana had dictated the document weeks earlier after a private confrontation with senior palace officials. Her message was unambiguous: their son was being shoved into the unthinkable position of choosing between his mother and father, and nobody, not the household, not the advisors, not the institution, had the right to turn a child's devotion into a bargaining chip. William read the entire file before he spoke. And the further he went, the more the text began to read less like a historical document and more like a portrait of himself. Diana described his sleepless nights. She described his fear of disappointing Charles. She described the way a young boy learned to bury his distress under a mask of obedience, smiling for the cameras while something inside him quietly fractured. The prince lowered the pages and stared at the window. His mother had seen all of it, even during the years he believed no one noticed. The chair scraped back. Catherine walked in and found her husband standing rigid beside the desk, one palm pressed flat against Diana's words. He told her, in a voice stripped of ceremony, that Diana had understood he was suffering. Then his tone hardened. The adults around him had understood too, he said. They had simply chosen to bury her warning. The final page of the memorandum deepened the blow. Diana warned that a confidential palace strategy was being drafted to recast her as emotionally unstable should she refuse to cooperate with future household briefings. Yet the most unsettling detail was not the accusation. It was the gap. An attached page had been pulled from the file, leaving an unexplained reference and a row of missing names. Whoever had removed it had known exactly what they were protecting. Charles received confirmation of the discovery elsewhere in the palace, through his private secretary. The king set down his pen without speaking. His secretary, watching the silence settle across the older man's face, registered one brutal truth. Charles was not shocked that the memorandum existed. He was shocked that his son was the one now holding it. William refused to return the file. He demanded the missing page, the redacted names, and an honest explanation for why his mother's final plea had been locked away for nearly 3 decades. The document had done more than reopen an old wound. It had forced every figure touched by Diana's last struggle to reckon with what they had protected, concealed, and permitted a teenage prince to absorb in silence. The memorandum carried Diana's name, but its deepest damage belonged to the family she had left behind. William saw in those pages the voice of a mother who had tried, and failed, to shield him. Charles saw a conflict he had spent years trying to outrun reopening in front of him. Catherine saw something more dangerous, a husband being dragged back into the unresolved pain of a childhood he had survived largely by never speaking about it. William had loved Diana with the fierce loyalty of a boy who understood too much too early. Even as a child he had sensed her loneliness and tried to comfort her when the noise around the family became unbearable. That bond had given him warmth, but it had also placed a quiet responsibility on his shoulders. He was not merely her son; in many private rooms, he had functioned as her protector. Charles had always viewed the destruction of the marriage through a different wound. The king believed that private grief became impossible to contain once it tipped into public spectacle. Yet the memorandum directly contradicted that belief. Diana had not been attacking the monarchy on those pages. She had been attempting to settle a single private issue, the emotional protection of her son. The betrayal sharpened with every paragraph. William told Catherine that the adults surrounding him must have noticed the fear, the restless nights, and the unbearable pressure to remain loyal to both parents. Yet every one of them had taken his silence as proof that he was coping. The future king remembered being coached to say less whenever the tension grew too loud. Duty, he said, had become another word for hiding in plain sight. Catherine sat with him in a private Windsor study stripped of aids. William folded and unfolded Diana's final page until the paper began to crease at the corners. The princess gently asked him to stop before it tore. He looked down at his mother's handwriting and admitted the words did not feel like a relic from the past. They felt like a caution addressed directly to the man he had become. Charles read a copied excerpt elsewhere in the palace. Diana had written that William was learning to disguise pain before he had ever learned what to do with it. The monarch closed the folder and quietly asked his private secretary to leave the room. He did not argue with the language. He recognized it. And that recognition carried more guilt than any denial could have. The memorandum then exposed something even darker. Diana referred to an unnamed senior figure who had warned that her private access to William could be tightened if she continued to challenge official palace briefings. Her plea was no longer purely emotional. It was now evidence of institutional pressure. And learned of the discovery through a documented archive report and immediately asked whether the original seal on the file had been compromised. The Princess Royal understood that a broken seal could mean one of two things: either the document had been opened before it should have been, or someone had been preparing for this exact moment for years and wanted it opened on their terms. William requested a private meeting with his father. His conditions were absolute. No courtiers, no lawyers, no rehearsed palace language. But before father and son could face each other, the prince first needed to understand the single confrontation that had pushed Diana to dictate the memorandum in the first place. The file did not begin with a lawyer, an archivist, or a palace directive. It began after a charity reception in June 1997, when Diana walked into a private side room expecting a routine chat and discovered that her relationship with her eldest son had quietly become part of a palace pressure campaign. One conversation changed everything. By sunrise, she had dictated the memorandum that would remain hidden until her boy was old enough to understand precisely what had been done to him. By that point Diana was already living under a punishing press cycle after the divorce. Her charity calendar kept her close to the public, and every appearance carried enormous symbolic weight because her popularity routinely eclipsed the formal royal household. That imbalance made palace operators nervous. They feared that one unscripted remark from her could reopen the family feud and weaken the control they were desperate to maintain. William stood at the center of that fear. He was entering adolescence, attending school, and beginning to register the cold hostility churning between his parents. The future king was expected to remain composed because his position mattered to the monarchy. What that expectation ignored was a simple, brutal truth. He was still a child being asked to absorb an adult war. Diana entered the private meeting expecting a routine warning about protocol. A senior royal secretary spoke in careful, bureaucratic language at first, and then crossed the line. He told her that any further unsanctioned interview, or any public challenge to the household, could force a reconsideration of William's private visits with her, framed as a measure for the boy's own stability. Diana pushed her chair back from the table. She did not raise her voice. Her anger turned colder than shouting. She demanded that her son never again be deployed as leverage, and warned the official that William already believed it was his job to protect everyone around him. The secretary attempted to soften the threat, but she had already heard enough. Later that night, Diana called a trusted advisor in a recorded private conversation preserved in his notes. She admitted that William was being trained to accept emotional silence as a built-in condition of kingship. Her fury slowly gave way to guilt. She understood that the public conflict had wounded him too, and she feared he would one day blame himself for failing to save either parent. By the following morning she had dictated the Kensington Memorandum. She named the official. She described the threat in clinical detail. And she demanded that her warning enter the permanent royal record. The document was copied and sealed. But 3 days later, a handwritten archive log showed that the file had been quietly relocated into a restricted cabinet under an authorization code linked to the sovereign's private office. William studied that same faded log decades later and pressed his finger against the cramped notation. He turned to Anne and asked whether his grandmother could have approved the transfer. The Princess Royal hesitated. Her silence carried its answer. Then William noticed a second entry. Charles had been informed of an incident involving access to the princes. The past had now delivered the prince to his father's private door carrying a document that demanded more than an explanation. It demanded an admission. There were no advisors to soften the language. There were no private secretaries ready to redirect the conversation. There was no prepared statement waiting outside the door. William entered carrying Diana's memorandum. Charles remained seated behind a small table. Between them rested nearly 30 years of carefully managed silence. Then William placed the document in front of his father and asked one direct question: "Did you know they threatened to use me against her?" Charles looked at the original pages but did not touch them. The king had already read copied extracts. Yet William wanted him confronted by Diana's handwritten annotations, the marks where her anger had broken through her own restraint. The meeting took place in a secluded Windsor sitting room, far from the formal chambers where every royal sentence could be managed. William stood before him not as heir to the throne but as Diana's son. Their relationship had survived scandal, family departures, succession, and years of controlled reconciliation. That history made the moment more painful, not less. They had rebuilt trust without ever opening the wound now lying between them on the table. Charles admitted, through the private conversation, that he knew there had been a dispute over Diana's access to the children. He insisted he had never authorized anyone to threaten her. William answered without raising his voice. Failing to stop the pressure, he said, was still a choice. The king argued that the household had been trying to shield William and Harry from relentless conflict. The prince's restraint finally cracked. Why, he demanded, did protection always demand silence from Diana and obedience from her sons? Why did every adult decision leave the children carrying consequences they had never created? Charles reached toward the memorandum. William kept one hand firmly over it. Neither man moved. The silence became unbearable. Finally, the monarch withdrew his hand, and his son told him those words would not vanish into another locked cabinet. Charles then revealed what the copied record had not shown. Queen Elizabeth had personally ordered the file sealed because she feared its language could destroy the last fragile trust between Diana, the palace, and the future king. The late monarch had intended the memorandum to remain private until William was old enough to absorb it. William stared at his father. He was older now. He had been an adult for decades. Why had no one returned the truth to him? Charles answered that reopening the file would have caused damage without changing anything. To William, the words sounded painfully familiar. Once again, someone else had decided what he was strong enough to know. The prince moved toward the door, then stopped. He announced that the archive authorization and the missing attachment would be investigated independently, even if the inquiry reached the king's closest advisors. William had finally confronted his father. But the deeper question remained untouched: who still controlled Diana's record, and who would lose power if the missing page returned? Within hours, the palace stopped treating the memorandum as a private family wound and began treating it as a threat to the crown. Lawyers examined ownership. Archivists reviewed access logs. Advisors debated whether Diana's words could ever become public. Yet behind those formal discussions stood one grieving son who had already made his decision. No office, title, or constitutional warning would force him to surrender the truth again. William entered the briefing knowing the system would speak in measured terms. Control of the file was split between the royal archives, the sovereign's private office, and the heir's household. Each branch claimed a duty to safeguard sensitive material. To the prince, that language sounded dangerously close to the same silence that had hidden his mother's warning for decades. Charles's advisors argued that any release could reopen old accusations and damage the reign. They warned that private family pain might metastasize into a constitutional crisis, a conflict serious enough to shake confidence in the institution itself. The king listened. William refused to let the discussion collapse into institutional survival. The prince told the room that the real damage had already been done. A frightened mother had warned that her child was being used, and powerful people had decided that child should never find out. His voice remained controlled. Every sentence still carried anger. The officials shifted their attention to the papers in front of them, but William refused to let them hide behind procedure. Catherine watched her husband wrestle between duty and grief. After the meeting, she found him alone in a corridor, still clutching the copied pages. The princess reminded him that exposing the truth could not come at the cost of destroying himself. William admitted that he did not know how to separate justice for Diana from the raw pain of becoming her son all over again. And confronted Charles privately soon after. She placed the archive log before him and said protecting the crown could not mean forcing William to inherit the same silence that had wounded his mother. The king turned away and admitted he no longer knew which decision caused less damage. The princess answered, plainly, that avoiding pain had already caused enough. Then the investigation shifted. A retired records officer confirmed through a documented interview that the missing attachment had been removed in 2002, just before William gained broader access to family archives. The officer remembered being told the page contained names too damaging for the prince. The removal order carried the initials of a former senior courtier who had served both Queen Elizabeth and Charles. He was still alive. He was still inside the household's orbit. William ordered him to appear for a private interview. The palace had tried to turn the document into a legal tangle. One elderly courtier was about to transform it into a confession. The former courtier walked into Windsor carrying no briefcase and offering no prepared defense. He looked exhausted before the questioning even began. William had expected excuses, damaged memories, perhaps another carefully protected version of the past. Instead, the man reached inside his coat, produced a sealed envelope, and placed it on the table. The missing page had not been destroyed. He had kept it for 24 years because he feared the day Diana's son would finally come asking for the truth. William sat with Catherine and Anne. Charles stayed away. The king had been told about the interview, but he understood that his presence might silence the man before the truth surfaced. The retired courtier explained that he had removed the attachment in 2002 on orders to eliminate anything that could permanently turn the prince against the monarchy. William asked why he had obeyed. The courtier answered, through the recorded interview, that he believed protecting the institution justified withholding painful information from a young future king. The prince stared at him and said that was exactly what Diana had warned about. Adults had decided silence was protection, then forced a child to live with the damage. And recognized the signatures before anyone spoke. She removed her glasses, studied the page in silence, and looked directly at the former official. The princess told him that loyalty without conscience became cowardice. He lowered his head. She did not soften the judgment. Catherine opened the envelope and handed the missing page to William. His hands tightened as he read Diana's final request. If anything happened to her, her sons must one day be told that she had fought for their freedom to love both parents without punishment. The word struck him harder than accusation.